Okay, now we're going to be looking at the Aeneid Book 6, and this is when we go into the underworld, isn't it? Okay. But before I actually go into the nitty-gritty of Book 6, just to remind you of the kind of extraordinary epic nature of the book itself, all right? And how this is part of what we could call, sometimes I talk about a renaissance, but that's the wrong word, isn't it? Because a renaissance is a rebirth. And this is actually a birth of Roman culture, isn't it? Traditionally, and even in the Aeneid a little bit, the Romans tended to feel culturally inferior to the Greeks, didn't they? But what's happening during Augustus's time is the Romans really are developing art, architecture, and literature that rivals the Greeks. So when we're looking at Augustus's many achievements, we have the military achievements, don't we? We've got the frontier achievements. Then we have like what we could call like kind of social organization achievements. But let's not forget that it's part of a massive culture. Again, I hesitate to use the term of regeneration. I think we should call it, cultural generation, isn't it? And I think by the end of the Augustan age, you have pretty much the finest kind of literature that Rome is going to produce, arguably. And you have this extraordinary crop of writers, don't you? Historians, we know, like Livy, and like Paterculus, etc. And then in terms of literature, you've got Horace, you've got Ovid, and above all, you've got Virgil, haven't you? And I feel as though we should always, if we're talking about any kind of assessment of Augustus, acknowledge that there's this extraordinary period of cultural regeneration. And behind it, we always have our man. Sadly, he falls from grace, but Maecenas seems to be the person who has the vision of the importance of history and literature and how that makes people feel. So in Book 6, I'm going to start with this part. We have the pageant of the heroes. Can you remember this? And the reason why this is so important is it is also in the Augustan Forum, is it not? Do you remember all of the statues? And again, I think that this is so important because we know that when Octavian comes to power, that Mark Antony could sneer and laugh at him and call him the son of a baker. Do you remember that? And we know that his background, really, in terms of poverty and status, is pretty sketchy, isn't it? But what happens is that there's a complete kind of rewriting, isn't there, of his origins. And here it says, next Mars's son will join the parade as his grandfather's comrade. We've got Romulus, haven't we? And we know that they're almost these sort of joint founders of Rome, aren't there? We've got Romulus, but we also have Aeneas, okay? Born of a mother herself. See how this man has twin crests crowning his helmet, and how the father himself now marks him with the stamp of godhood. Now, this is the interesting bit for us. Here's the man. Why is he not named, I wonder? Under whose auspices famous Rome will encompass earth's full extent with her power. Now, I think what's really interesting there is, again, we've got this kind of imperial pride and consciousness, this sense of the vastness of the Roman Empire. And do you remember I said I think it's really important that Agrippa is the first person to have a kind of map of the world placed in Rome. Do you remember that? Just to show Romans how much of the world they control. And this is what I would call, part of this kind of imperial consciousness that they're trying to inculcate into the population. And in courage will rival Olympus. Wow, this is big stuff, isn't it? One city's circuit of walls will embrace 7 citadel summits. These are the 7 hills of Rome, yeah? Well fulfilled in her offspring of men, as mighty Cybele, who in her turreted crowd rides a chariot drawn. Okay, so why I wanted to point that out was just the fact that the culmination of the pageant of the heroes is, of course, Augustus. So it becomes like the kind of end of history, doesn't it, or the high point of history. It also shows the importance that Augustus and his propagandists had to this idea that Rome was one continuum. Now, think about this. Why is that so important to them? Well, rather than being an innovator and a person who is reformulating Rome, he is in fact part of this long line, you see. So if anyone then accuses him of destroying the Republic or, destroying the traditions of the Senate, like Tacitus does later, his counter-propaganda is, no, look, I come from this incredibly long, unbroken line, okay? And what does Virgil go on to say? He says, here's the man you've heard promised. So he becomes basically a prophecy to you so often. And I think I said to you at the time, don't forget the word Messiah was being thrown around a lot at the time, wasn't it? Because obviously one of the many things that happens during the Augustan period is the birth of Jesus. And so I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that here Caesar is being represented as a kind of Messiah, isn't he? Yeah. Caesar Augustus, born of a god who will one day establish all through the farmlands of Latium once. So isn't that interesting? Here he is born of a god. Long ago ruled by Saturn, ages of gold. He'll extend Roman power beyond the Garamantes, east beyond India too, to the land that lies under no map stars. So again, it fits in with res gestae very much. So if you're writing about the frontiers, guys, it's nice to use the literature as well, isn't it? Because what you're seeing here is this absolute pride that they want to take in this idea of imperial expansion. Don't forget, at the end of his life, Augustus says, don't extend the frontiers any further. He would argue that's all part of being better a cautious commander than a bold. But you could also argue that even in death, he wanted to be the one, didn't he, who expanded Rome's borders to the utmost, and that it was impossible to go beyond this, yeah? Outside the paths of the year and the sun, where sky-bearing Atlas spins on the shoulders, etc. So you have all of this epic poetry, don't you? What we call epic simile. And it's part of the power that the epic has in terms of kind of legitimizing the power of Augustus. So when we think about he has no more potestas than anyone, but he exceeds everyone in terms of auctoritas, that's true to some degree, isn't it? Because a great deal of his power in the Principate does come from what we would call soft power, doesn't it? From all of this literary stuff, architectural stuff, etc. All right, we'll now move on to Book 8. All right, so Book 8 moves on out of the underworld. And the important part of it, I think, is when they are given these extraordinary weapons. Do you remember? Venus is on their side because, of course, she's kind of like his distant mother or grandmother, isn't she? And don't forget that Venus's husband is Vulcan, who is the forge god, the metalsmith god, isn't he? Okay? And in Book 8, the bit that I'm going to concentrate on quickly now are the weapons that are given to him. But in particular, I'm going to concentrate on the shield, which I think is so important. Okay? These were the words that she spoke as she brought herself into his presence. See, they're completed. She's talking about the weapons that she's now going to give to Aeneas. Now, don't forget, in our syllabus, we're told what are these parallels between Augustus and Aeneas. And they are just so incredibly established in Book 8, aren't they? It's literally like they're the same person, don't you think? And the shield that's given to Aeneas so that he can establish Rome is also a symbol that gives him total continuity with Augustus. These offerings crafted with skill by my husband, just as I promised. My son. She's speaking to Aeneas, isn't she? But she could be speaking equally, don't you think, to Augustus. Show no further reluctance to challenge either proud Laurentines or even Turnus. Remember, Turnus is their mortal enemy that they have to fight in order to establish Latinum. Fearsome in battle. This, she said, Cytherea's goddess approached so that her son could embrace her. So again, we've got this kind of glorious idea that Rome was founded by gods and goddesses. And this is really important. You'll all recognize this symbol, just as all Augustan Romans would have. Set under the arms, under an oak tree's radiant branches. Well, what does that remind you of? Of course, it reminds you of his oak tree. And let's not forget, the oak wreath was given for saving a Roman citizen. Do you remember that? But in his case, it wasn't an individual. It was for saving Rome itself. So it's a wonderful example because, again, it gives him a kind of divine status. But at the same time, we said this before, that it's so different to have an oak wreath rather than a crown. Yeah? So to have a sort of oak wreath crown is really interesting because it symbolizes what Augustus is, isn't it? Both a kind of king, a divine king, but also a plain Roman who rejects all of the symbolism of monarchy from the East and all of the monarchical terms. Let's not forget, he absolutely studiously avoids titles that will make him a king. And I think that that's absolutely key. And this will happen in the Shield. We will talk about the Battle of Actium. Most historians agree that Actium can't be said to be a particularly important battle in terms of Rome. But in this Shield, which kind of tells a history, it becomes the absolute center point of all Roman history, doesn't it? And in the middle, of course, is the triumph, and that triumph would be the triple triumph, exactly. So what does that say? It says that the present is the most important part of Roman history. So the Shield is a kind of summary of Roman history, isn't it? Yeah? Do you remember this as well? The other weapons there, the igniter of fire, who was neither unversed in the seer's prophecies nor uninformed about the future events. Why is that so important? Because this would also fit in with the religion, wouldn't it? It would say that Augustus was prophesized, wasn't he? He was predestined. It wasn't that he luckily won the war against Mark Antony. Right from the inception of Rome, this is what the gods wanted, isn't it? Yeah? The triumph of Rome's achievements, Ascanius' future line of descendants. Again, there's a direct line. Forget kings in Europe who might be like 4 or 5 generations away. He's going back 1,000 years by a direct line to Ascanius and to Aeneas, isn't he? Okay? Running the width of the shield and dividing the scenes ran a golden pitcher of rough seas. And I won't go into all of these now, because just to remind you, we go from the outer bits of the beginnings of Rome and everything, and as we go inwards, we hit the Battle of Actium. And so his victory against Mark Antony, therefore, becomes the absolute zenith of Roman achievement again. That's why I say it is almost like a Messiah-like thing, isn't it? Okay? As it says in the Aeneid, centrally placed, fleets depicted in bronze, the whole conflict at Actium. And when you think about it, guys, that means that his victory was predestined 1,000 years before in the Shield, wasn't it? Yeah? And here, this is a beautiful bit here. Listen to this. Caesar Augustus on this side is leading the Italians to combat. And we know that it's a great tactic of his to say that Mark Antony is a kind of foreigner, isn't he? We know that he either calls his enemies, even when they're Romans, he calls them factions, or he calls them pirates, doesn't he? And you remember that he was always at great pains not to declare war on Mark Antony, but to declare war on Cleopatra, yeah? And therefore he avoided the idea that he was a kind of propagator of civil war, and instead he establishes himself, doesn't he, as the great champion of Rome. So here he's the Italians, isn't he? He's got the household spirits and gods. So all the Romans read that and they go, oh, the nice familiar things from Rome, don't they? Yeah? His paternal star, well, look, the comet's there again, isn't it? Okay, so that's a reference to Julius Caesar. It's like, he is the figure of pietas. We've talked about this a lot, haven't we? How important it is that his battles are not for ambition, etc., are they? They are the battles of a man of pietas who does things for his family, for his father, and for Rome. On his temples is blazing war's proud metal. That's interesting, isn't it? The naval crown with its pattern of ships' rams, yeah? And then on the other side, we have Antony. And notice immediately, look at the next clause, backed by a foreigner's wealth. Antony is a traitor, isn't he? He's an enemy of Rome. International forces. So Antony's not a Roman, is he? He's part of this nasty coalition of foreign, scummy, horrible people, yeah? Faces them, fresh from the Red Sea and the Gulf. Oh, boo, Middle Eastern kind of regions, isn't it? Peoples of the East. Look, they're just a horrible bunch, aren't they? A promiscuous, heterogeneous bunch of non-Romans. The Middle East strength and remotest Bactria, all these weird other places, yeah? And this is a fantastic bit. Look at this. Following him, what a crime. That's such a beautiful interjection, isn't it? It's like he has to pause to say how disgusting this is his wife. And see the pause? Who is Egyptian? Now, don't forget that Octavian's powerful propaganda against Mark Antony took the form of the fact that he was a betrayer of his nation, that he was dressing in Greek clothes, that he was cavorting with Cleopatra, that he was going to gymnasiums. Do you remember this? That he was doing all this disgusting Greek stuff and having people worshipping him. And all of that we know was very successful. So here Virgil is reinscribing this idea that Antony is a betrayer, a traitor, and the other. Vessels all rush out together. The whole sea surface is foaming, thrashed by the tug of oars and the three-pronged rams of the ship's prows. Out into the open water they race. You could think that Cycladic islands uprooted. Again, we've got all the epic simile, haven't we? As though this is a godlike battle. So if we quickly go back, he has to take this battle of Actium, which was a little bit of a disappointment, a bit of an anticlimax. And what does he do? He turns it into this gigantic Titan battle with roaring seas, etc., yeah? And it says here, such was the mess in which the men gave battle in their turreted warships. Torches of blazing pitch hand-launched scatter, as do the flying steel-tipped shafts, and on Neptune's fields it's the slaughter that blossoms red. In the midst the queen cheers on her troops with the sistrum. And I think that I'll stop there because that would be more than enough to establish the idea that the Battle of Actium is completely redrafted as a fight between the East against Rome, that Mark Antony has lost his Roman citizenship, his Roman identity, and rather than this being a kind of civil war, it instead becomes a vanquishing of a foreign enemy. So just to sum up why the Aeneid is so important, well, we have all of the stuff that shows that that Caesar goes back to the earliest origins, that he is in the pageant of the heroes, that he is the end point of Roman history. And then that's echoed again in Book 8, isn't it? Where even years and years before, the gods had decided who would win this battle, and it's like he is the predestined leader that comes back to them in triumph.